As a soulless virus spread, vulnerability and disparity bred. A nation that can lead the way, guided by head and gilded by heart. Alas, saw the divide drift further apart. To rise above prejudice and give way to justice. To embrace every human with equity and dignity. It's time for true humanity. Our tomorrow calls out to us, invoking passion and purpose. And what each one of us does today can influence our way of living and rise as a nation of a billion thriving.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? All right.
Yes.
So again, it's a pleasure to be chatting with everyone, and welcome to this discussion where we will get a little bit into what is the role for a collaboration between the government and the private sector, especially on sanitation. I see a lot of experts and participants have joined, and would just request everyone to please treat this as a dialogue. This is meant to be a learning lab. This is meant to be a discussion. There is nothing more boring than a long monologue. So as we get into it, my name is Anant. I'm from Dasra, and my role really is to ask a few questions, get people started, and also be a little bit like as they say, agent provocateur in the conversation. So with that, would love to get us started, and as we do so, we heard the house rules, and again, please do make sure that wherever you have any questions, you reach out on chat to Mohit or Johan. Um, Very quickly, you all have seen the topic, and it's really about what does it take to scale innovations in WASH, and we this is particularly interesting at this stage because there has been, as many of you would know, a very significant outlay that has happened by the government into the sector. But as we'll discuss, that alone potentially is not enough. So, what is it that will take to scale innovations? What stops the innovations from scaling? We'll hear diverse perspectives. We'll hear perspectives from the government. We'll hear perspectives from innovators, from funders, and we'll hear perspectives from really people who have been helping them scale. As we get started, very quickly, you'd all have, please look at, some of the people who are in the audience, and you can obviously see who's on the participant list. I think what is interesting is there is a real opportunity today to get beyond the rhetoric. PPPs have had a lot of rhetoric around them, some good, some not so good. And today, let's unpeel a little bit to what it takes with real examples, real change agents, and again, we have with us people who have actually done it, and we can discuss and learn from each one of you. As we get started, a few points for us to consider before we dive straight in, and we are going to start with a poll very quickly. So I hope all of you are quite energized. As you can see on the screen, this is not by any means the only topic, the only sector, but the reality is, the water and sanitation sector usually scores very, very poorly compared to pretty much every other sector when it comes to CSR giving. And part of the challenge is this is the plumbing. This is literally the plumbing. And things which are plumbing are usually taken for granted. And when things go wrong with the plumbing, guess who suffers the most? It is the people who stay potentially on the ground floor. So the reality is, how do we deal with innovations in a sector which on its best day is invisible? And the reason I am reminded of, I grew up in Delhi, I'm reminded of how electricity cuts every night used to be a matter of norm. It almost used to be a ritual. And, in Bombay right now, electricity cuts are unheard of, at least where I stay. Now, why do I take that example? Is there a future in 10 years, in 5 years, when safe water and safe sanitation are taken for granted by the next generation? It's taken for granted in such a way that it's not a major topic of debate and discussion. So what does it take for us to get there? So that's the first point. And again, we have funders, we have people who have sought funding, but the reality is the sector is not prioritized right now. I think having said that, the second point, which is which is fairly important and important to recognize and address is how does such a sector deal with the fact that there is a very huge opportunity right now to scale up. What do we mean by that? What we mean is the sector right now has close to, if you can see the screen, close to 4.5 lakh crores, which have been made in financial outlays. And again, if we can sort of just take a minute and if you can stop sharing, please, I'll share screen. Thank you. I think the main point is there is a very significant amount of budgetary allocations which have really happened in the sector. Just to give everyone a sense, if you were to take the total private philanthropic giving in India, and it has as we have looked in the India Philanthropy Report, that has hovered in the region of about $10 billion a year. What the government has put in terms of just outlays in the budget, and obviously this is largely in sanitation and water, it is almost equal to what the entire philanthropic sector, the private sector, puts into philanthropy as a whole in India. What that basically means is there is greater than a 10x multiplication potential right now if really the right kind of actions happen by the private sector to put in risk capital and to put in the right kind of innovation capital into WASH. The reason this is fairly unheard of and quite important to note is it is very rare. Right now, we are not talking of efficiency multiplication. We are not talking of multiplication where a breakthrough innovation happens. We are purely talking about a financial leverage, which means if you put in X amount of money as an innovation capital, the government has earmarked close to 10x of that to actually scale up these innovations. And why are these innovations important? One could argue saying, look, it doesn't really matter. The government's already put the money. There is no need for the private sector to do anything here. The reality is the government money is earmarked for scaling innovations which are proven. What that basically means is unless something already is a proven innovation on the path of scale, it cannot be paid for and used by the government, which means if the vulnerable have to be catered to, if women have to be catered to, if people with disabilities have to be catered to, if our slum populations have to be catered to, if innovation capital does not come in now, we will have a lot of money, but that money will not solve for the vulnerable. So in summary, the three messages I want to bring in are one, it's actually a sector where private capital has so far largely ignored it, especially when you think of CSR and when you think of some of the UHNIs, etc. Secondly, it's a sector where the government has not just woken up, has actually taken a very, very bold step forward. And the third is the timing is now to actually focus on innovations because they can scale. We also requested, Mr. Rao from Niti Aayog to, we were expecting him to join, but he got pulled into some key meetings. But there were some key points, he wanted us to highlight. And these are points from the Niti Aayog. These are points which the government is saying, look, we would love to partner if it's possible. One, service delivery, especially provision of safe sanitation, water, especially to the vulnerable populations, will need innovations coming for the next 5 to 10 years. That is very critical and that's very clear. The government has acted and put in significant amount of budgetary outlays in the two key flagship programs, the Swachh Bharat mission and the Jal Jeevan mission, as you all know. Thirdly, the government is quite keen to support innovations and obviously has been doing a lot around Startup India. I think the most interestingly, and we have today, and I'm going to call upon Dr. Malini from Administrative Staff College of India, but there are now real examples on the table of groups such as that collaborating with the government to actually put in place vehicles to further innovations, to champion innovations, and not just create innovation hubs which are sector agnostic, but create innovation hubs which are quite focused on sanitation as a sector. With these few messages, I'd love to bring in Dr. Malini and request you to share some perspectives, both in terms of what is innovation as you think about the sector, why is innovation important but difficult, and also how do you think about innovations going forward, especially working with the government with some practical live examples. Dr. Malini, if I can bring you in, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anand, for this. I'm going to do a bit of a change here because I thought, Anand, that innovation is one of the most important factors for contributing to the development of a society is known to all. India has been moving up on the innovation index, albeit it's been in the sectors of IT, in the sectors of high-tech manufacturing, healthcare, and of course, pharma. Uh, However, innovations in municipal service delivery, specifically in the area of water, sanitation, solid waste management, hygiene, are somehow not yet there on the radar. And I think this is an area which is of immense importance to any country. And it's high time all these stakeholders work towards building the right ecosystem to make this happen. But I think it's very important for all of us to collectively demystify what innovations in this space really is. And while ASCII has been working on establishing a platform for bringing multiple stakeholders together, which means the innovators, funders, researchers, academics, government, bringing all these people together on the same platform so that the information gaps, the knowledge gaps can be filled and people can collaborate. And there are many successes there. I would right now like to pull in with a real life example of a city which has actually implemented several innovations in sanitation, so that we can understand how things function. Because it's very easy for us to right now have a discussion on why innovations in water sanitation are not really coming up in India or not being implemented at the pace we would all want it to in cities. But I think it'll be very interesting to start on a great positive note. And I would like to pull in the Commissioner of Warangal City, a city which is known as a city of innovations. It has made a mark for itself. Thank you, Ms. Pamela, for joining this session. So Warangal city, the second largest city in Telangana, has made a mark for itself, is known nationally as a city of innovations. And of course, one of the biggest reasons for that is the leadership team. And lady like Ms. Pamela, who is open to implementing innovations. So Ms. Pamela, we would like to hear from you basically on 2 points. One, how did you manage to bring in so many innovations in the city and across the sanitation value chain? And secondly, while we find it very challenging to work with cities, what is it that the cities find as a challenge when they want to implement innovations? What stops you from bringing in more innovations than what you're already doing? So on these 2 fronts, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Good afternoon, everybody. Mr. Anand, Ms. Malini, thank you for having me here, and to all the other participants listening to this conversation today. I mean, it's really a privilege to be described in this manner, that we are very open to innovations. Certainly we are. It's not just me, but historically, Warangal has been a hotbed of all the implementation activities, the first pilots that you can say. I mean, ASCII has been a very critical partner, without which we would not have been able to implement. And also we have the support of Urban Management Center Asia. So these are the 2 partners who have been historically handholding all our interventions and bringing in new pilots which are relevant in the context of the city and especially the wash sector. So just answering your first question, like how do we bring in? Probably I would just, enumerate a few points on what we brought onto the table. So like everybody is aware that right in 2016, with the support of ASCII, we were the first city in the country to declare formally the fecal septage management rules, FSM rules, in 2016. And that was when we also passed a resolution in council deciding on the dates and how do we carry out the fecal sludge management. After that, we put in baby steps to have 40 KLD FSTP in place. That is types of fecal sludge treatment plants. One is based on your geotube technology, the other is on thermal pyrolysis based. So these are very doable interventions, and it was done with the help of CSR with Banka Bio and Tide Technocrats. So till date, we have been able to treat 4.2 million liters of fecal sludge. So which is really something appreciable for a tier 2 city like Warangal, which is not the capital city. And looking at the Warangal model, setting the decision to set up FSTP has been now adopted throughout the state of Telangana, and many small town urban local bodies and small municipalities are also taking efforts towards establishing a FSTP. Not just that, we went ahead by training operators for this, carrying out the scheduled desludging, that is desludging of the septic tanks once in 3 years. In fact, we were one of the first ULBs to train women as well. So we had women FSTP operators and women desludging operators with the help of ASCII. Then we installed IT interventions into the model. We had a FSM tracker, a GPS tracker, where we could see where our desludging truck is moving. These were the small add-ons to one decision that we took towards fecal sludge treatment. Then we set up a beautiful park around the FSTP, because the moment we say fecal sludge, a very different kind of picture comes into our mind. So we set up the entire 40 KLD unit into a sanitation resource park. I assume there's a sound disturbance. Is it for everybody or is it for a specific?
I think it's at your end, ma'am.
Okay, fine. I'll just switch off the fan, I guess.
So just to reinforce a point and connect with what Anant was saying earlier, this is a city like Warangal, which decided to collaborate with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who through grant funding established a real state-of-art fecal sludge treatment plant. And of course, Banka Bayalu, Ms. Namita is here, who through her own CSR funding established another plant. Now, these two pilots, the first of its kind with new technology, once implemented and once set in that beautiful sanitation resource park, became really a role model and gave tremendous confidence to city officials, not just in Telangana, but across the country. I mean, the number of people visiting Warangal is tremendous to learn from these experiences. And this had led to scale up of establishment of treatment plants in both the states of Andhra and Telangana to the tune of 200 cities plus, and that all this through public funding. So this is to Anand's point that when you have a small bubble of funding available with philanthropy and the funding available with governments is large, essentially the role that philanthropic and corporates can play is play that catalytic role where they can help innovators implement a pilot, prove that it works, and then people like ASCII, people like Dasra, these organizations can come together and provide a platform to ensure that this scale-up takes place with public spending. Thank you, ma'am.
So just to add a few more interventions that we have been taking. In fact, we were the first ones to launch the Malasur campaign in collaboration with media in Warangal, and that also has been scaled up throughout the state of Telangana as a very inevitable part of our Safai Mitra Suraksha Challenge under Swachh Sarvekshan 2021. So the steps may be very small, but the initiatives may be very small, be it in this in the sector of IEC or in really taking up projects and grounding them. Warangal has been a very conducive atmosphere to, we can say, a test laboratory kind of thing. Then we also had a very large-scale state-driven intervention of constructing at least one public toilet seat per 1,000 population. So given the fact that we are, as per the 2011 census, we have around 8,20,000 odd population. So what we did is we constructed around 330 public toilet seats in record time of 2 months. So why I'm mentioning the statistics here, I can see the chat box, is it is important for all of us to sink in that 330 public toilet seats in 88 locations, I mean all of different models, is a pilot in itself. So is there this sound problem still? I cannot. There's no sound per se here, but I think there's some.
That's okay. Please carry on.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. So what I was saying is, so we consider around 330 public toilet seats, and what happened is we got to see different models. One. Already we were the pioneers in carrying out the PPP model or the BOT model on a large scale. We already had 44 public toilet complexes on that model, which were running really well. After this was more like an EPC model, we can say, that we piloted right now in this last 2 months. And we had prefabricated toilet vendors coming in and installing their specimens in Warangal, and we had our own local constructions taking place. So that was in itself it was a pilot. And as a part of O&M, we were the first city to engage the transgender community on a sustainable scale, because it was not haywire one or two random pilot, but we have made conscious efforts to hand over our community toilets, our public toilets, loo cafes to transgender community. In fact, I remember that Dasra had done a detailed article on the same as well. So we were also the city, if I remember correctly, we had developed a very detailed level, service level agreement for implementation of, for engagement of communities in O&M of toilets, and that was also being scaled up across the state of Telangana. Other than that, we had initiatives like setting up STPs in housing complexes. For example, the government of Telangana does a very prestigious flagship program called 2 BHK Dignity Housing. So when we have a huge complex of 400, 500 odd houses coming up in one locality, it becomes a township in itself. And there, under CSR, we have been able to set up 300 KLD STP plants as well. So, going further, we are also planning to set up a department of sanitation. I think we'll be the first in the state of Telangana to do so, and even government is looking forward for this initiative, because then the technology partner, ASCII being the technology partner, it can be scaled up across the state. Other than that,
sorry for interrupting, but this is fascinating and very, very inspiring, Pamela. And I think there are 250 people on, and I think the one big message we are picking up is there is a lot of pull and there's a lot of enthusiasm on the side of leaders such as yourself in the government ecosystem. And I'd love to, if I can bring you back in a minute, but I'd love to actually ask a question now to the broad audience, because we have innovators, we have intermediaries, we have funders, and if you can bring up a polling question on what actually stops us, and the reason, and the question is, please try to be as brutally honest as you can. According to you, in your real lived experiences, there are so much going on. There is so much going on. What is stopping us? And it'll be good to hear everyone. And I'll then bring it right back for some deliberation. We have 221 people to vote. So yes, we are only at 10% of the voting. So we'll wait a little. Mohit, if you can share once you hit about 60% polling, that'll be great. Yeah. We're at 45%. Okay, so Mohit, if you could share screen, share the results, please. Great, thank you. No, so again, we heard from Ms. Pamela and we heard from Dr. Malini about how much is possible, if really the partnership happens. Having said that, this is close to about 100 people in this audience who were asked the question about what is the greatest challenge that we face in building the WASH innovation ecosystem. And interestingly, the single biggest one, almost by a factor of 2x to the nearest second factor, is lack of a deep partnership between government and the private sector, and then of course lack of flexible capital, innovators, entrepreneurs, and business ideas. But the single biggest one is lack of the deep partnerships, and just to dig a little bit deeper into, again, lived experiences on that. If I can, just request Namita, if you're on, to please come in, and I think it'll be quite powerful to hear a little bit of, you have really set the stage in terms of building a successful sanitation business, and really Banka Biolu creates very interesting on-site waste treatment, but also very interestingly, you are one of the women leaders to have successfully built a sanitation business in India. Could you share, of course, a little bit about your journey? What has been the highs? What have been one or two things where you are most proud about in scaling innovations? But more importantly, also, what have been some of the challenges you faced, and how did you negotiate those challenges? Clearly, you have been able to negotiate and build a successful business there. But I'd love to bring you in, and please, again, as the conversation goes, connect it back to some of what you were hearing as well. Namita?
Hello, can you hear me, everybody?
Yes.
So a very good afternoon to each one of you, and thank you, Anant, for asking me to speak. And I am thankful to each one of you, Dasra and ASCII, to really appreciate my work and bring me today to speak on the challenges and the business model that I have developed. So first thing I would like to announce that innovation is there, and Banka Biolu recently has got the DSIR's recognition and certification from the government of Department of Science and Technology. Just last week we got it. So this shows that there is a lot of innovations that can happen, and government is recognizing the need, and it's also recognizing it's recognizing the efforts that people have put in this industry. And definitely this was it's been almost 11 years I've been working in sanitation field with the need of a basic need of a clean toilet was the thought as a woman came into my mind, like while traveling in trains, while traveling in trade fairs, exhibition where we couldn't find any, and we all were a silent sufferers. 50% of the population was a silent sufferer. And that is what made me start thinking that if I am suffering, I think most of us are suffering. And that's how the whole thing started. And to tell you frankly, I didn't understand the meaning of even sanitation when I started. But I only understood one thing: there are no toilets, there are no assets, and they're not clean. And it is causing us health issues, because I was one of the victims of the health issues. So starting the story there, but of course it helped me to really understand the need, and the need of course was very, very large. When we started speaking to a lot of people, we realized a lot of women, they all wanted it, like, so the want of toilet I could see. And definitely there has been a lot of partnerships, lot of things that has happened, evolved over the period of time, and I can see the change that has happened in 2011 to 2021. Discussion that we are having, and I think today the level of discussion we are having is going to be a sea change for the next decade. It's not going to solve the problem in one day, but the thought process have started. So that's the point today I'm trying to make. Secondly, the challenges what I really started facing was that there was no policy, there was nobody doing such a thing or even thinking about an enterprise level work in sanitation. It was like, I've got a commended, are you a Dalit? Do you have a family background of that kind? Or you are, you're not supposed to do, it's not a glamorous business. So I have received all these kind of feedback where people were not happy with what I was trying to do. But ultimately, I just felt that this is going to be my mission for the next 10 years or 15, 20 years, whichever I'm going to be there in this field. I failed many times, no doubt about it, in terms of designs, in terms of execution, in terms of partnerships. But ultimately, the point was that when you take up any project as a mission and you want to do it and deliver, you will find a way out. And as Anant rightly said, that negotiations, yes, there had been a lot of negotiations, technology, terms of money, terms of many, many other things, like, of course, raising even, and then highs, definitely we bagged a lot of, so the first challenge I was facing is sustaining my company, how to sustain my organization. When I started in 2011, I was singly running this company with just one partner of mine, and I did not know how I'm going to sustain this, because buyers were there, but they were not the payers. They didn't want to pay for it. The need was there, but there was nobody paying for it. So definitely then I looked at railway as a very big client, because that was their need at that time. And they wanted somebody to really look into the toilet problem of maintenance of the toilets, as well as solving they used to adopt a lot of technologies, but they never worked. So what was the main issue? So that's how we started working. And slowly my aim was to move to the rural, which was at the back end we did. And we have been serving the rural India for quite some time now. So this was what I feel in sanitation, is that perseverance, patience, and of course, lot of talking to a lot of people have been my this thing, and telling them that this is a problem and we need to solve it together. So partnerships, I have many partnerships, and I'll name them in the coming this thing when we talk more about partnerships. And I thank each one of these partners of mine to help me to come to this place today where I am.
No, thank you, Namita.
I hope I solved all yeah.
No, it's inspiring to hear you speak and hear how you got started with this mission. I did want to bring in Divyang from Tata Trust, and specifically, I'd love, Divyang, if you could help react to the point Namita, I think, made, which is it takes a superhuman entrepreneur to actually break through the barriers, one on sanitation, and secondly, if a woman leader is trying to really solve this issue, it takes superhuman effort. And what has been your experience? What has been personally something which has driven you to actually focus on this as yourself and Tata Trust? But also, what do you think are very practical things which come in the way? For example, Namita spoke about asking for credentials of how many times have you done it in the past. Potentially is one of the single biggest things which will come in the face of someone doing this initially. So I'd love for you to come in, Divyang, and just share your perspectives and your personal mission on this as well. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Anand. I think very quickly, great work, both Warangal and Bankabalu. I think your question is very important. And I think when we work in the foundations, broadly, we work a lot on the due diligence element. And I think that becomes sometimes frustrating for many entrepreneurs and the innovators. What as the trust, I think what we feel, and we in 2016 we realized that it's important that we need to create an ecosystem. So there are two ways to do that. One is creating an enabling ecosystem. second, you look at the system strengthening as a part of fostering the whole startup, or you can say innovation ecosystem. So I think in 2016, the trust actually look at, if you want to do this differently, you need to have a spatial purpose vehicle to foster those ideas. Within the set philanthropic ecosystem, there may be a statutory challenges, or there may be a challenges, in terms of the execution, or in terms of your due diligence and other process. So you need to have a different set of an organization to do that, which understands the startup ecosystem, the challenges they face. So that was the first area which I think in 2016 as the trust, we incubated an organization called Foundation of Innovation and Social Entrepreneurship, which actually looks at the more life cycle approach. So in terms of not only looking at the idea, which is at a very nascent stage, but how you can actually bring that idea to from pilot to the proof of concept to the scale stage. And it's important that the foundations or the philanthropic resources can be effectively deployed as a soft capital. Someone has to take a risk in this. If everyone would start asking a question that, okay, where is your proof of concept? And based on that concept, someone will fund you. I think then the whole ecosystem or the innovation space is not going to, get the traction which it should require. I think in that context, we started this whole, life cycle approach where you support the pilots, but also at the same time invest more resources into the developing proof of concept. I think that's very, very critical, because I think someone has to take a risk, and I think that long-term risk financing is very critical. So as an institution, we took a stand and they say, let's provide those platform and a level playing field to the incubators, which has resources available, and they can focus more in terms of making their ideas work in a real life situation. So that was the very initial thought, and I think based on that we started working. Second area which I feel we understand that we also need to engage with the government ecosystem, because we bring not only the a long-standing experience, but at the same time we would be in a position to influence some of the policy elements. And I think that's the another area which I think we kept on working in terms of how you can work with the government, work on the system strengthening element, and at the same time try and see that how some of the policies could be influenced. I would also like to share some small example here, that one of the major challenge in the incubation sector, most of the people facing the working capital. Now, working capital financing in this space is very, very difficult, because it's broadly financed by the government. The whole water and sanitation sector is predominantly funded by the government. So that working capital financing is very critical for any entrepreneur to sustain and ensure that they are actually reach to that tipping point where they can achieve the scale. So that I think the another area where we started funding the working capital financing to the incubators or innovators. And at the same time, we also tried and see that how we can handhold to see that they can actually move to the next level and become a kind of an entrepreneur. From innovator to entrepreneur, a journey is important to build that bridge. And I think that's the area where I think we as a philanthropic funding, we feel it's important enabling and catalytic role to play. So that's, I think, the two areas which I feel is important for us, working with the incubators at one side, but at the second side, you need to also work with the government to also create an enabling environment within that, so that they adopt and accept the innovation and take it on a scale. So that's I think the ecosystem where we started working on and trying to keep on actually supporting that ecosystem to grow more and faster.
No, thank you, Divyang. And before I go on to the next person, I think you said something interesting, which is, everyone wants a guarantee. Unfortunately, if everyone wants a guarantee, then where will innovations happen? And you use a term, right, which is risk capital, which means if 100 rupees is put in, maybe 50 rupees will try to do something, but will fail. But there is actually value in the failure, and celebrating some of that, and actually considering that risk capital as not wasted capital is a very powerful thought. I'd love to bring Dr. Malini just for a second on this, because enabling women entrepreneurs to actually come in and not just take that risk and take the risk capital, but also enable others is something, is something potentially so inspiring and so powerful. But there are hurdles even bigger than we see even for the other sector. I'd love for you to come in, Dr. Malini, for just a minute on your perspectives on that before I move on, just in terms of what have been your experiences as you have not just helped others, but also experienced, what are some of the challenges people have to go through?
No, I've had the privilege of interacting with really strong women like Namita and many others who are there as panelists here. I think the biggest challenge here is in the sanitation sector is that while 50% of the workforce really comprise women, it's very challenging for many people in the sector to look at women playing a larger role than what they are right now. And I think we've worked with a few women entrepreneurs, brilliant ladies. Namita came into Warangal with her first plant and now has more than 40 projects running in the city on a public-private partnership mode. You have organizations like PSafe, a lady who brought in a toilet seat sanitizer and has taken it to such scale that you would love to carry that in your bag wherever you go. You see someone like TrashCon, where when everybody is talking about the challenge of how do we segregate waste, this lady just brings up this brilliant technology which is patented, and now she has more than seven, or I think close to 10 implementations in cities, which is an automatic segregation of mixed waste. Is like a God-sent, thing to cities, and the byproducts are converted into pavers, plastic products, and also composting of the organic waste. So I think the opportunities are large, and I don't see that the funders or governments differentiate between a woman entrepreneur and a male entrepreneur. But there is definitely a requirement for women to look at this sector and think of themselves as taking that larger role. And for us also as enablers to think of women beyond an SHG network, and think of them as playing greater technical roles, greater managerial leadership roles.
Yeah. No, thank you, Dr. Malini. I think that is very critical. Leadership roles, technical roles, and really thinking of the full spectrum is very critical. I'd love to bring in Manas. Manas, if you're there, you have had a really scenic journey, and you have really built, operated decentralized wastewater, fecal sludge treatment plants, and you have used IoT and technology in working in Leh and Ladakh, working with the government. Talk a little bit about how has the journey been, what has enabled that, what are one or two things which have been hard, which people can learn from, but also talk a little bit about what keeps you going in this journey.
Yeah, thanks, thanks, Anant. So in Leh, let me talk about the enablers and briefly talk about the story as well. We were invited to Leh to look at whether fecal sludge management would be viable and suitable for the town in around early April 2017, I think it was. We had tremendous reception from the government. They wanted the solution because the groundwater was getting polluted, and being a tourist destination plus just a culture which really values its environment and so on, they wanted to do something about it. It was less than 1 month. We met with the key customers, who would be the hotel industry, big households, guest houses. The government took us, they drove us around to 4 sites. They said, these are 4 plots of land we have. Which one do you want? We got back to them in about 3 weeks with a commercial and a technical plan for a public-private partnership. Saying, we'll invest this capital. This will be the tariff structure, which we had already discussed with the hotels and the guest houses who were the primary customers. In a month's time from that first visit, we had a contract in place, we had land located, we had electricity permission, and the government said, We will basically get whatever permissions are needed. We will take care of it, right? You just design and start constructing. 4 months, less than 4 months from that first meeting, the treatment plant, the fecal sludge treatment plant was up and running, and we were providing services to the town on a city-wide scheduled desludging basis. The cost actually turned out to be lower than what people were paying to unofficial desludgers to provide the service. And now this included cleaning the septic tank and treating it, right? So I would say that the key enabler for us in Leh was a very, very committed, proactive, active, I would say, government who just said, look, tell us what you want, we will do it. There was a high level of trust, partly because there were personal relationships where the head of Borda, who facilitated this, was from Ladakh. We were able to get the funding in because we kind of understood some aspects of the local terrain. And you can't get away from this aspect that if private players and government have to work really well, they need to in some way know each other and trust each other. Now, I'm not talking about some sort of crony capitalism where we figure out how to loot the system or maximize profit, but a certain level of trust between decent people saying that you can do what we want and we will support each other and we'll solve problems together, versus this sort of L1 arm's length, sort of zero trust, police state kind of relationship, which tends to happen where you can't solve problem later. You lock yourself into a situation and then, you kind of try to make a bad situation better or worse. But, that's not how it works. So one of the comments, that I had just coming from what we heard today is, see, in sanitation is largely a local problem. A town can fix its problems regardless of what the state, country, or the world wants to do. Okay, we saw that in Leh, we are seeing that in Warangal. So when local officers really want to do something and they say, we will do it differently, let the country do whatever it wants, right? But we will work closely with players. We will build a trusting relationship. We will provide chances for mistakes to be made and corrected. We will provide long-term support because you can't do it through 2-year contracts and 3-year contracts, or time passes by very fast. And you build that ecosystem of people who have a certain vision and a roadmap. Now, the other thing in Leh now, what is not worked so well in Leh is they were building a sewer network. And so we built a certain capacity. We said, this is a capacity we can build right now because we see it. Now, today we're running at 120% capacity, right? But because there's been, some people have moved since then. So, the officers who were involved in the early days, they've kind of moved on, and now other people want to take, their time in the sun. But, we're not getting clarity around the sewer network, when it will come online, what it will cover, what will be the tariff, what will be long-term demand for and need for FSM services. So we are not willing to then invest more capital to expand our services if we don't have a certain roadmap ahead of what does the future look like, right? And this is where a town level plan and having a vision of where are we going is very important, both for investors and for private players to come in. I also play a role in the Take a Stake Fund. And there we are really looking at backing people who have reached a certain scale, because we feel there's plenty of innovation, and doing the innovation is relatively easy. But with sanitation, you're looking at infrastructure, you're dealing with poverty, you're dealing with a basic need, you're dealing with large capital, long-term sort of infrastructure plays in some ways. So if there's no clarity and a roadmap, it is very tough to do things. And India has seen that whether it's with roads or water, when you do things in a very haphazard way, today we'll do toilets, tomorrow we'll do water, then we'll do FSM, then we'll think about solid waste. That's not the best way to do it. You need an integrated plan at a city level, at a state level, and then you can bring in the right players and say, okay, here's a 10-year roadmap, here's a 20-year roadmap. What can you do? What can you do? What do we need to do? And how do we make it work? So I think that's the starting point, which is very, very necessary. And that's when investors will also come in. Today, public sector banks are not willing to finance a contract if you win it from a municipality. I mean, what kind of trust are we talking about here, right? When a PSU bank will not fund a government project. So I think that's really what we need to fix at the core at a certain sense.
And Manas, just on that last point, thank you. We heard 4 points from the discussions so far. One was, the need for supporting the innovator itself, the person. We heard about the town roadmap, some degree of long-term thinking. We heard about the municipal leadership and the key role they play, at least to be, champions of this. But I think you spoke about the last part, right? Which is, unless there is a common set of metrics and simple, commonly agreed way of measuring those metrics, it's very hard for risk capital to work with scale capital, because one really doesn't know whether one is moving or not. And that has been a perennial problem for other sectors as well. In your view, where is the sanitation sector and wash water sector on just that aspect of simple, transparent metrics which enable risk funders and scale funders to work together. And obviously that also has an element of the banking sector also having the confidence. Just share your thoughts a little bit about that before we move on. Yeah.
Anant, on the whole, I would say I don't think we have really moved much in that direction because everyone has very different priorities and worldviews. And when you say risk capital, I scratch my head and say, what is the risk capital? I mean, by and large, most philanthropy is not really, I would say, is not really risk capital. In fact, in some ways, philanthropists want such guaranteed results. They'll tell you today what you're going to do 3 years from today, month by month or quarter by quarter. That is, that's the exact opposite of risk capital. Right? Risk capital means you react to what is going on and you evolve and you still chase an end goal, but you don't sort of lay out your roadmap in quarterly detail for the next 3 to 5 years, right? So I feel that there is really no discussion happening. And like you said, the big capital in the room ultimately is the government capital, right? I mean, that's, multiples of, like you said, when you started. So I feel that, metrics are important. A shared roadmap is important, but we also need to push this down to a local level of decentralization. I really think the city or the town is the unit at which action happens and solutions happen or don't happen. And unfortunately, at the government level, there is very little freedom and flexibility given to the town, right? Capacity is also weak, financing is weak. They're sort of constantly looking at the states and ki agle saal kitna paisa milega, kya kar sakte hain, right? So I feel that it does require a human resource strengthening. And on the company side, I would say that look, entrepreneurs don't have long runways. Okay, we see so many social enterprises going, shutting down because they can't survive another 3 months or 6 months without cash. And we don't have good customers for them. See, the US, if you see, the government is the best customer for the high-tech industry in the US, which is why they survive. They pay a high amount, they give you lots of support. They'll give you an order for 10 years from now. They'll say, you develop this, and 10 years from now, we'll buy this from you, right? And that is what allows high-tech in the US. People don't realize. People think it's some free market economy. It is not. The entrepreneurship and innovation in the US is completely underwritten by the US government. Now, if you don't have that kind of visibility and your government doesn't pay you, and lately had that problem. 5 months, we didn't see a rupee come in. Finally, we told them, look, if we don't see the payment right now, we're going to shut down. We're going to fire everybody and shut it down. And that's when the payment flow. Now, why does it need to reach that point? So when you say capital, I would say bring 3 capital, bring that innovation capital, bring the growth capital, bring the government capital onto a similar platform with city level, engagement and roadmap and problem solving. And I think a lot can start getting solved when that conversation happens. But it also has to be a long-term thing. Entrepreneurs cannot be thinking about how do I pay next month's salary. Very hard to really build a business. That was slow growth, slow payoff, long-term business like this is different. If I think that in 3 years I can do an IPO and have a lot of money, then maybe the motivation is different. But we're not going to see that in this sector, right? I mean, look at Namita's story is 11 years of slog, right? How do you keep people motivated for that slog? I think the government definitely has a role to play, and long-term investors need to play that role. That's what I would say. And I think using too much blended capital also, to my mind, is not very good because philanthropic capital does come with different mindsets and strings and motivations. I would instead say that we need VC funders who have a more long-term and a true patient capital approach from a VC perspective, not from a philanthropy perspective. I think more of that is needed if we really want private players to emerge who will contribute to the growth of this sector.
Great. No, Manas, thank you. And I think, I'd love to bring Bharat, you in. And, I think what we are hearing is there is obviously people who can do this. There are ideas which are worth backing. But there is a little bit, I guess, a mismatch between, the life cycle of the innovation capital itself and the kind of things which need to happen. And again, you have sort of worked through the full life cycle. Talk a little bit about how could this be solved, and a little bit about what should philanthropists start thinking about, either doing more, Bharat, or doing less to try to start solving this, or at least starting to have the dialogue around this. And again, please, come in with what's worked, but also what may not have worked. Thank you.
Sure. No, thanks, Anant, and thanks for having me in this wonderful discussion. I think Manas made a lot of the points that I think are very relevant. So I think it's a good segue to the question that you asked me in many ways. Because Manas the role that philanthropy has often played of saying, look, I want fairly clear outcomes before I'll even step in, is a very pertinent one. But at the same time, to your question about how that can actually be solved, I feel like, in many of the points that Manas made, I think the seeds of potential solutions are right there. Right? So you think of the fact that government has actually provided commitments to an entrepreneur to say, look, we are giving you a contract to build out a certain piece of infrastructure or whatever else it might be. That can provide potentially the guarantee that the philanthropist is looking for before they say, hey, I'm going to step in and fund something, because they know that the government at that point is committed, and that in itself represents scale. Right? So if that is the outcome that the philanthropist is looking for before they're ready to come in, it is right there. And then in the longer term, hopefully the government payments can start to kick in. And maybe it's the government that's actually paying through a DIB of some kind. They're actually paying the person who's taking the risk of whether this solution will actually work or not. Right? So I feel like there are innovations like that which are already, they've been tried out in various ways. But I think that it's sort of some structured finance arrangement of some kind, which I think needs to be stitched together in a fairly in a fairly scalable manner before I think a solution to this can emerge. Because I do think that in the role that we play as venture capitalists, I think again a point that Manas made, which is that there is a need for patient venture capital to come in and get small startups to scale in a sector like WASH. I feel like that's true across all of civic tech, as we call it at Omidyar Network, right? Which includes not just WASH, but a bunch of other related sectors, things like air pollution and so on. And as we've thought about civic tech, I think one of the key bottlenecks is exactly what has been mentioned in the discussion so far, which is that, while it's the government that's the key customer, the government is not a great customer, right? And therefore, for a startup that's building their business entirely on government orders, this question of where does the next paycheck come from? Is there enough visibility into order flows? Is there enough visibility to say that, yes, this is a viable business so that a venture capitalist can actually come in and back them with funding? That is not really quite the case right now. So that, I think, as you start to unpeel that, I feel like it requires a little bit of problem solving in addition to the structured finance point that I made. I think it also requires a little bit of problem solving around questions of how does the government procure, as you think of norms of procurement, as you think of questions around not just lowest cost bidders and sort of those types of systems, but also requirements of at least 5 years in business, a certain balance sheet size, and so on. Those kinds of restrictions that the government often has in procurement play a real role in saying that smallish startups can't actually come in, or they can only come in on the back of partnerships with larger providers, which actually meet some of those requirements, right? And I think that needlessly constrains the ecosystem, and it's understandable why those sorts of constraints exist. I mean, clearly those procurement norms are there for a very good reason. But at the same time, I think it's the need of the hour to say what can be done to actually address those constraints as well. So yeah, those two thoughts I think would be my proposal in a nutshell, Anant, which is to say, can we look at structured finance arrangements as well as procurement reforms that can actually get more startups into the room, which then in turn can unlock venture capital and other forms of capital.
Yeah. And Bharat, just adding one more to your mix, which is, like what we were hearing, the right kind of coaching and, right kind of, it's a lonely job. It almost seems like a backbreaking and lonely and sometimes excruciating job as an innovator, because it's almost like you've got everything to do yourself. So how does that become a bit easier? And like you're saying, part of that could be the peer network, part of that could be a little bit of a coaching role. But I think this is interesting because it's not just intent which will get us there. I think there is a little bit of that intent coming together on these three aspects, which you talked about, and we know that some of these are already underway under civic tech that you all have been helping on. I did want to bring in Abhishek, and Abhishek, you obviously again have been running a business and using technology very effectively. But I'd love you to focus a little bit on how you have looked at raising capital. What have been the challenges you have had in working with funders of different kinds, and what has been your way to convince them about both your idea and what are some of the realities of the sector. And Abhishek, as you come in again, please do share a little bit about your story, what motivates you, but double click, if you don't mind, a little bit about fundraising, and what has been your journey there?
Thank you so much. So firstly, I represent a company called Lou Cafe, where we have a concept where we've got a retail outlet or a POS, which is a point of sale, and toilets all around it. So we started this entire concept a couple of years ago, which is around 3 years today, and have been growing at a considerable speed. Now, coming back directly into the case of funding, yes, in India, it's extremely difficult when it comes to anything which is innovative. It's more brick and mortar, which we talk about. When we talk about brick and mortar, when you as a startup go across to any banking body in the country, they would actually look at a 3-year-old balance sheet and a typical brick and mortar or a secured kind of funding kind of a concept to actually start funding any new concept of business. But yes, it's a journey, which is a tough journey to cross that line of 3 years. Once you cross that line, then with certain amount of secured funding kind of a concept is where you could actually look at raising funds. Now, what we've been able to do right, I would say here, is that we've been able to have certain clear and a nicer, larger formats of JVs at various levels, which has actually helped us to scale the entire project at the various levels across the country at this stage.
Got it. And Abhishek, as you were to think about that, is there, like, what would be your one takeaway around innovation, fundraising, especially to make sure that it's easier to communicate what you're solving for, because that seems to be one of the challenges in terms of fundraising itself. How do you convince a funder about the fact that there is a risk around this and there is a little bit of a gestation period? What works?
Communication, yes, plays a very important role. Now, we need to first categorize ourselves into any kind of product, specifically in the area where we are, which is the world where it is more linked with government contracts and stuff like that. So you need to be very clear whether you're going the CSR route or you're actually scaling up the organization and looking to raise venture funds or banking funds into your organization over a period of time. So your projections and as well as sustainability plays an extremely important role in getting the entire fund cycle in place. Why am I mentioning sustainability is there is a lot of study and research which needs to go into any product which is getting into the local public or anything which is getting onto the ground, where you've got a lot of other civic societies involved as well, is understanding what was happening in the past, what are the current models which are working, and clearly any model which can become self-sustaining as a model and has a clear ROI plan could get funded with a clear or a decent track record. I think that kind of a communication with the right projections is what is important. I would also say this, that in case you could put that right, there are several venture capitalists or even the banking bodies who could come across and help you to raise funds. But the idea is that can you really put the entire structure right? And the gestation period is slightly longer in this case, where you need to really wait for that 1.5, 2 years or a 3-year mark where you prove yourself over a period of time. And that particular time is the most important time, procurement cycles, right? So that you can get certain amount of credit from the vendors where you are actually working with and get the entire cycle of sustainability or balancing act in terms of revenue generation also coming in place in a decent manner.
All right. No, thanks, Abhishek. And as you were also speaking about this, and some other people also spoke about this earlier, I think finding a way to get that narrative, simple yet powerful, I guess, is going to be quite critical. I'd love to get in a little bit of a global perspective on this, and if you're on, Cecile, firstly, thank you for joining. I don't know what exact time it will be for you right now, but it'll be great to hear a little bit about how have some partnerships especially helped solve, and many of these challenges might seem very, very, you've heard some of these as well in other places. What is the role of partnerships, and how do we think of partnerships as it solves for either capital, it solves for trust, or it even solves for capacity building? Love to get your thoughts and speak a little bit about your experiences as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I have to say, it's been really interesting to listen in on the discussion so far. So I guess I've been asked by Dasra to give a bit more of a generic sort of WASH Innovation Funder perspective. And I should caveat it by saying I don't have any expertise in WASH in India. So this is very much a perspective of us being a funder of global humanitarian innovation in WASH. But that being said, I think a lot of these points do ring really true for me. I think the big difference here that I see coming out in the points that have been made here today is the big role that government plays in WASH in India, which is great, and it's something that I think we're really missing in humanitarian innovation, is this kind of big adopter and co-scaler of innovation. And someone who can put lots of funding into the scaling process. I guess I wanted to make a couple of points. So something that we have really started to look at more is kind of what are all of these barriers to scale for our innovators, and which of those barriers can they address themselves and alone, and which of the barriers actually need to be addressed by other players in the ecosystem, and how can we support that? So that's something we're trying to do by shifting our attention from just funding innovation teams, so funding that first part of the innovation journey, and kind of giving them a load of cash and then hoping that they can scale and address the challenges. We're trying to say, okay, how can we work with the potential adopters of the innovation to help them de-risk it, so de-risk adopting new innovations, which I think is a huge factor in adopting innovations. It costs you money to learn a new way of doing things, and maybe have a backup solution in your pocket to train people to use a new thing, to monitor it really closely. How can we help put finance into that side and actually incentivize adoption and help adopters de-risk it? How can we coordinate the evidentiary requirement? So I think this point was made as well. Kind of what is good enough to scale? What is like good enough proof of concept, and who is taking the risks? And I think there's definitely more coordination that can be done around setting standards for what is good enough evidence for fecal sludge treatment in terms of reduction of pathogens, and what are the technical specifications that we can all agree on that particular technical area, because that makes it easier for innovators, for suppliers to actually reach a broader market rather than having to cater to lots of different specifications. So that's kind of one thing that we're really trying to say: how can we shift some of the finance from the supply side, from the innovators themselves, onto the adoption side? And the other thing that I think we're starting to look more into are these kind of longer term partnerships. And it sounds like in India there are lots of really good partnerships with government. I think in humanitarian innovation we can't in the same way have the partnerships with governments because it's sort of more about global responses to various crises. But I think it's about how, I think the principle is the same around how we can actually bring both innovators and potential adopters together to do kind of longitudinal needs forecasting. So what are the solutions that we'll need in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years? And then actually how can we go hand in hand in developing those, and again help de-risk it for the innovators? So to actually say, in 5 years, if you have developed a good enough solution, a service provision for FSM to solve this particular problem, we will be here as a buyer for it. And that's something we've seen UNICEF doing, for example, in humanitarian WASH innovation. And I think there are some really good examples out there. So maybe I'll just finish on that to say, yeah, I think the these points around the ecosystem that have been made by other people earlier. I think especially what Divyang from Tata Trust said around creating a life cycle approach and being clearer about who's taking the risk and how we can help make that journey smoother, I think is really important to us. Thank you.
Thanks, Cecile. And I think I think you made a great point, right? Which is how do you invest and strengthen the ecosystem and not just the innovator? Because sometimes with late stage innovations or late stage opportunities, you can still fund the one entity. But here, unless we fund the ecosystem, and something to do with also what Bharat was mentioning, it's very hard for individual innovations to survive. No, thank you. As we, there are a few patterns, and before I move on, I did want to put up what are some things which are emerging, and I'd love for everyone to reflect for a minute, and then after that, I'd love to bring in a couple of more participants. I think there's a real opportunity with how much capital now actually exists or will exist from the government to actually think of what are the structured financial instruments or arrangements. And I'd love to hear, Arundhati, you a little bit after this, as you think about that first one. Also the role of partnerships as you think, because like Bharat said, all the three kinds of capital, innovation, growth and risk and scale, have very different approaches to investments. I think the second one is how do we reduce barriers for first-time innovators? We heard some stories of absolutely amazing willpower, but how do we make it easier for others to follow, especially for women entrepreneurs to work with governments? But also maybe like we heard from Ms. Pamela, how do we make it easier for the government leaders to also work with the sector? I guess it's equally hard from that perspective. Thirdly, common metrics. We spoke about this. Manas spoke about how do we make sure we keep the hurdle clear and not too high for ideas to actually move to the next level. And then the last point really is, while there are many, many incubators, all of them are like 3-month programs and nothing happens in 3 months. It's usually a 3 to 5 year journey to move from, an idea to something where you feel you are stable. And that is usually missing. So, what is the role really that the sector can play? But as we think of these 4 areas, I'd love for Arundhati, if you could come in next, to share a little bit about what's been your experiences, what can be done, and what are the challenges in actually bringing together these forms of capital in a way that they can work together. And are there any 1 or 2 examples you've seen as successful? That'll be great. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Anand. I think so a lot has actually been covered by all the speakers, and I would more so just reiterate, but just kind of coming back from my experience and not just IntelliCap's, while IntelliCap, of course, believes a lot on ecosystem approach, and that is why we're talking about that. When you're talking about innovation to scale, what is the kind of ecosystem approach you can take? But I'll just step back a bit and maybe kind of pull in from the experience I've had in past, which also brings in a lot of work I've done with not-for-profits, where we looked at really small-scale innovations, right? And here I am also moving away from not just services right now, but also product innovations, because that's where sometimes, larger, you don't know how to kind of access fund and how to then commercialize them, because these are small innovations and mostly in water sectors which are happening. So we've seen that there are smaller point of view systems for water delivery systems. And now, since we were talking about SVM as well as Jal Jeevan Mission, this is a large part of WASH, which we need to kind of address. And I know we focused a lot on sanitation and FSM, and that's why I'm trying to take the focus a bit towards water right now. So a lot of small scale innovations are there. And unfortunately, there are lesser options of how do you kind of provide these capital to them as well, right? So these lot of innovators fail to reach scale or let's say commercialization, because that these lab to land connect is slightly difficult for them to make. Is I would say one of the major reasons is capacity issue, because a lot of innovators also don't know that how do you really access this capital? How do you really, so a lot of I guess there's a market entry barrier, which through capacity building, through handholding support, and I think so we need more of incubator and accelerator platform at that space, and more of private sectors who can then be commercial partners and can help them take to scale. So one is that area. Coming to the work, I have seen at least in structural finance, and I think so Manas did shared about a bit on how there is this working capital issue. And I think so all others also touched upon it. So for a lot of smaller innovations who have done one round of funding and then they don't have working capital, because with government, there's also challenge of delays in payment, right? And how do you address those delays in payment? So you definitely need some structural financing instrument there, which can at least take care of those financing gaps and delays in payment. So we've been working right now as part of our work with Gates Foundation, where we're trying to come up with those kind of financing mechanism, which at least can take care of the working capital. And I think so that's something which at least in BMGF projects also have been taken care by in a couple of states. It's been done in FSM, where they're looking at the third-party account systems and kind of taking the payments through escrow accounts. So these are smaller innovations, but a lot needs to be done to take care of the working capital. And I think so NBFCs and banks need to kind of come in there to see how can they really, address that gap. So that's one area. I also feel, and I strongly agree with Manas on the impact, because for a lot of these early stage to mid stage innovations, it is important to really measure the impact, and then which is going to feed into creating more market for or a better ecosystem for these innovations to reach up to scale. So I think so impact matrix is something which is very important, and we need to kind of look at it. Another challenge which I definitely, and I think so no one has talked about, is I would just want to put light on, which I've seen, is how do you also ensure these innovations are somewhere certified, validated? Is there a mechanism which can really be created? I know there were initial set of discussions on, and there has been something like Marshall Committee, which looks at technology validation, but are these, is there a way to certify these innovations? Or can, like energy sector, can we draw some parallels and have some kind of incentivization mechanism of it qualify certain, just like in energy, you have a BE standard. So are there ways to kind of also incentivize some technologies or innovations and then kind of look at it? So I think so these things would definitely create some kind of, would steer this ecosystem, and these are smaller innovations which can be looked at. Yeah, over to you, Anand. I don't know if I've been able to kind of address all your questions, but yes, some initial thoughts.
I think the point you made about the certification is a pretty interesting one, because in a way, without that, it becomes very hard for individuals to then make the case. No, thanks, Arundhati. And as you think about this, I'd also love for little bit, Mr. Masood, if you're on. You have been, as Ramki, really at the cutting edge of, really looking at how the topic of waste management in the country works. You have been working with, municipalities and really thinking about innovations. Do talk to us a little bit about how does Ramki support innovators, innovations, and what is your philosophy about, using CSR funds to promote innovations? And as you heard some of the discussions, what would be one or two of your recommendations to the sector, especially CSR, on taking some of this ahead? Over to you, sir.
Thanks a lot, Anand. I think I'll not repeat what has been said, although a lot of that resonated with me. I'll touch upon, I think, two thoughts that I had looking at innovation in the context of solid waste management. Those who know me primarily because of the many mistakes that I've made in that particular field, and the fact that I've probably lost more money in that space than anybody else in this country. So that's my sort of reason to be here. And the lessons that I learned along the way, especially in the context of innovation, is, I think, one is policy predictability. The fact is that laws today are responding to community expectations, global trends, emergent issues in a very reactive way. And therefore, policies are evolving much faster than probably investors are able to keep track of. And especially innovators are probably able to keep track of. And by the time you sort of innovate and scale and have something which is viable, it's probably past its best by date. So policy predictability and having some degree of foresight, policy foresight, informing innovation is extremely important. And that's a lesson that we have learned in the waste management field. The second is actually, this probably the shift from individual innovation to ecosystem innovation. Unfortunately, the solid waste sector in India has had too much innovation. I mean, every city, if you ask me, does has its own solution, and that has led to fragmentation of solutions. That has not allowed really mainstream solutions to attain scale, and a track record of failures has basically spooked away investors from this space, and the social impact or the public health impact that some of those innovations could have potentially represented never saw light of day. So I think it is very important for innovators to also aggregate. Alliances and partnerships, I think that point has been well made, is extremely important, because without scale, without longevity, neither the viability gap issues, the business model sustainability issues can be addressed, and therefore nor can the impact objectives ever be met. So I think it's important that we learn from what has not worked, and eventually move towards a situation where there is some standardization, there's some mainstreaming, at least for a period of time, which says, okay, you know what, we as a policy will move in this direction over the next 5 or 10 years. Each of the investments that we make today, and when I say we, I'm talking about both Ramki as a company and KKR, which is invested into Ramki, has needs an asset life cycle of 15, 20, 25 years. You tell me, where would solid waste management rules be? Where would community expectations be 25 years from now? And I'll design to that today. So I think policy stability and having an ecosystem innovation approach, as opposed to every city. I mean, case in point, I probably manage more waste than anybody else in this country, but the fact is that even after managing maybe 7 odd million tons per annum of waste, today I'm just not even scratching the surface. 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 tons of waste in this country, doesn't matter what kind of waste you talk about, municipal, industrial, biomedical, or any other form of waste, goes unmanaged. Now, in this context, unless you find solutions that can really scale in the near term, we are talking about a situation where, both from a social responsibility standpoint and from a public health standpoint, we remain exposed. So I think, so my learnings are that I think, instead of every city trying to find its own innovation and its own solution and its own little basement, which is brilliant, I think it's important for some of these things to aggregate, for the individuals to come together, to learn from each other's learnings, and to stop their innovation, and which is counterintuitive, I know, for all of us who've tried and learned that it doesn't work. We have to learn to fail fast, and we have to learn to fail cheap, because the sector is too big, the cause is too big for innovation to take a toll on it.
No, thanks, Masood. And in a way, that last point is pretty critical, right? Because it's sometimes the lack of having some discipline which goes and kills many good ideas. I think in a way, I'd love to bring in two more people. I'd love to first, bring in Nirat from Dalberg. And just before that, though, I think that first point is where a coalition or a partnership has to do something, because and we obviously have people who work with the government, but in a way, I think also figuring out what is the common standards. And thank you, for making that point. So because it's sometimes very hard to measure and very hard to really know when one has succeeded and when one has failed, which is potentially then very hard for a late stage investor to really come in. And the simplest thing a late stage investor can do is avoid the sector altogether, because it's so complicated and so hard to measure. So in a way, I think thank you for bringing those points of how to do less, but while doing less, how to have certain longer term picture in place to inform decisions. Virat, would you like to come in a little bit and share specifically, as you think of what would be one or two things which the sector can do in partnership, and especially what philanthropy needs to do now to actually take the first few steps? And I'd love to get one recommendation from you, which is like, yeah, this is a call to action. And again, talk a little bit about why you are so passionate about that recommendation. Thank you.
Thanks, Anand. So I think I love the sort of discussion so far, and especially the last sort of the point that Masood made. If you, from our vantage point, when you look at water sanitation, different parts of water, different parts of sanitation, it becomes quite clear that actually when we talk about innovation across the entire value chain, we're not talking of one kind of innovation, we're talking of multiple kinds of innovations, which have different profiles, right? These innovations require different levels of investment, and hence the end state has to be different levels of consolidation. If you have a problem statement that requires a lot of innovation, and yet the market, like Masood said, is very fragmented, it's quite unlikely that you will actually recover revenue on that, and you won't actually get adequate levels of innovation. So first of all, we need an overall map of the whole ecosystem, right? And the map of the unsolved problems, so to speak, and the kind of innovations that will solve for it. Across the value chain, you have, let's say, basic science innovations that are needed that probably require tens of millions of dollars of R&D. You have maybe process innovation, which is much, much cheaper. You have behavioral innovation somewhere in the middle. You have small UX innovation, which again is not super expensive, right? So innovation of different kinds costs different kinds of money and should be structured in different kinds of institutional setups, right? If you look at a country like India, one of the key things that sometimes gets very confusing for innovators is this conceptual confusion around who is the customer. Is the government the customer and they pay money, or is it the end user who's the customer and they pay money, right? And oftentimes the vocabulary and the dialogue in the sector is only exacerbates problems, right? And it leads to situations where those kinds of procurement contracts, those kinds of revenue arrangements don't fall into place. I slightly differ from Manas when I say that actually blended finance, blended revenue models have a fairly important role to play, not necessarily on the supply side, but on the revenue side. I think having clear sort of clear guidance there would be very, very helpful. And again, completely agree with what Masood said. There's a huge amount of regulatory flip-flop, right? And we've seen multiple business models fail, let's say in Punjab and water, when the regulation changed and that business model was no longer viable. So I'd say that the couple of things that we could do is have an overall map of the problems that need innovation across the water sanitation value chain. Then for different parts of that map, have stable guidance on the kinds of players, the kinds of investment that are needed, and hence encourage different kinds of actors to participate. I think somehow we anchor too much on startups for innovation, and I think fundamentally there's a problem with that. If you look at, there's this principle of symmetric B2B relationships or G2B relationships, right? So more startups fail working with the government across the world than any other sort of type of institutional structure, right? So you need patience, you need long sort of, you need deep wallets to be engaging with government clients, because there's tons and tons of delays that happen with procurement, with payment, and hence this opens up a whole sort of I would say opportunity to actually have licensing in place, right? So if we can actually have startup technology being licensed by larger players who then become service providers to governments, I think that would be something India should really definitely try and do. And then I think the last point I'll make is innovations. If you look at all the drivers of innovation diffusion, right, the kinds of things that accelerate the diffusion of innovations, one of the key things is compatibility with the current ecosystem, right? So you can't drop in a new component and expect that to work with the existing ecosystem of sanitation. But oftentimes we don't account for the current systems that exist. Let's say there's a lot of talk on sanitation worker safety, right? But the reason a lot of these innovations are not working is because they're not compatible with the existing system that exists in that city, right? The sewage networks, the skills that exist, and hence looking at longer term sort of procurement horizons where we think of procurement as a whole system and not just independently would be very useful. So those three things would be quite important too.
Thanks, Anat, and very, very valuable. Chintan, would love to get you in as really the final discussant on this. I mean, you really worked with one of the leading incubators in IIM Ahmedabad, and really the CII sets the direction for incubation. Based on what you're hearing a little bit, and also, of course, the pain points which I guess you experience very closely, what would be your call to action for philanthropists in particular, but the sector in general, and why? And talk a little bit about why you feel passionately about some of those, Chintan. Thank you.
Thanks, Anant. And I think wonderful discussion. I think really great points that have emerged. I've been taking a lot of notes. So yeah, I think a lot of stuff has been covered. I mean, I'll quickly look at 2 or 3 points. I think we have had some discussion around whether the incubation processes in WASH is hyperlocal, or does it need to be more national, and the issue of scalability, which Masood also talked about, very important points. But the fact of the matter is that when we are looking at very early stage innovations, when we are looking at startups building solutions, especially in the WASH sector, my sense is that it needs to be very hyperlocal, and I think a couple of other speakers also talked about it. That it's really, and the examples that we took were all very city centric, right? So therefore it needs to be a hyperlocal model of incubation, right? If you're looking at supporting startups and innovations, you can't build the ecosystem in India, or you can't build the ecosystem in Karnataka. It needs to be city specific. Having said that, and touching upon the point that Masood was trying to talk about, so there will obviously be some models which need to emerge, which need to scale beyond cities, right? So it doesn't mean that every city has its own unique model of WASH, right? I mean, they will be. I would not even say startups, and that's also the other point that some speakers talked about, that it's not going to be just startups who are going to bring innovations. It may also be not-for-profits. It may also be some hybrid structures. It may be community organizations. It may be civil organizations, etc. And that's why the hyperlocal nature is important. So you need to have startups which have the ability to work with these folks in cities. Some of these models will emerge. There will, of course, be another set of startups which are horizontal in nature, right? Which will be tech startups, and they will be more scalable. Their solutions can be applied across cities, but there will be startups which are building the value chains. And the value chains will be fairly complex in these sectors. I mean, if you look at solid waste management, one startup may not be able to do all sorts of solid waste and look at the entire value chain. You may have these folks working together with each other. So I think there's a I mean, as a recommendation or as an incubation process to catalyze the ecosystem, there needs to be a city-centric approach. And if you look at the top 20 cities in India right now, because of the great work that the Department of Science and Technology or Atal Innovation Mission, all these organizations, and even the state governments have done, most of these top 20 cities will have at least 4 to 5 functioning incubators per city, right? So there is possibility of creating, along with the local government, some city-specific incubation programs which kind of plugs on all these gaps which exist there. It could be in terms of collection, it could be in terms of processing, it could be awareness generation, habit change, etc. And it needs to work in tandem. And I think that's where companies like Ramki and the more scalable kind of models can then plug on once the local ecosystem is kind of ready. So I think that's one quick point I had. And also the other related point is that it may also require capital in different shapes and forms. While the more scalable models may attract VC funding, there may be some, maybe it's not right to call them startups. These will tend to be more local social enterprises which may scale to a couple of cities or in a region. They may need a different sort of funding. We also talked about innovation funding. That's a critical piece, because there are not enough entrepreneurs who are kind of innovating at very early stages. So you may need fellowships, you may need grants, you may need entrepreneur in residence kind of programs which are operating at city levels where folks do some kind of business model innovations, technology innovations, and some of them then move to the next level. So therefore, the capital sector also needs to fall into place in that sense. So I think these were a couple of points which I thought are important. We need to probably address innovations and startups which are more local and more regional, and we also need to sort of tackle them separately, maybe have specific programs along with government which are focused on that, and then look at a separate category which are more scalable and probably more deep tech in some sense. I think the role of making sure that because all of this will require working closely with the government, and a lot of these smaller startups, entrepreneurs may not have the wherewithal to directly work. So therefore, I think that's where the incubators role come in. If we could create programs where, as part of the program, the startup or the entrepreneur gets to work with the government and maybe do pilots, etc. Because in any case, we are trying to think of doing it in a hyper-local manner. That's one of the ways in which this issue could also get tackled. Of course, once the model is validated, once you start scaling up, there could be some government contractors that you work with. I know that VCs in general are not very comfortable funding a startup which is directly working with the government. It's considered as high risk. So if there could be some government contractors, etc., more established players that you are able to work with, that's the other way in which some of these risks could be taken care of. Yeah, just these couple of points.
Thanks, Chintan. I think very useful food for thought. And with that, let me actually bring in Professor Chari from ASCII. And really the question is, what we discussed today will need three parties to come together in a very powerful way. The government at the micro-local, the hyper-local level, at the municipality level, the government at the national level who sets policies so that there is some amount of predictability, like Masood said. Second, of course, is the innovators who are really the heart of this, but who need support, who need some amount of visibility, but who also need really the sounding board. And lastly, philanthropy, who I guess has the right intent, but really this is a complex sector. It needs to be demystified. Professor Chari, if I can ask you two questions. One is, what do you feel is the role for really players such as ASCII and others who are going to bring this together? And why do you feel that is critical? And then most importantly, how can a philanthropist participate in this, given, of course, the reality we talked about, but given the opportunity which is in front of us? Over to you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah. So allow me to sort of use a couple of slides, which I try to put together while all the eminent speakers, shared their perspectives. So I will just use a couple of ideas to convey our experience in this. So can you see this, Mr. Anand? Yeah. The question is, what next? So we had very different perspectives, and we had Pamela ji talking about the innovations that Warangal is trying to do and what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, and we have different speakers speaking about the positives as well as the challenges. Now, how I look at this and what are my views, I will try to communicate through a couple of statements. Number one, with regard to safe sanitation, municipal solid waste, water, and when I say solid waste management, plastics, the other related areas, on a scale of 1 to 5, I think my view is we are at 2. In fact, Mr. Masood would agree, a country with 4,000 plus municipalities We are trying to put together a database which cities have done well with regard to municipal solid waste management, and Masood Saab will bail me out. We will not find more than 50. So when the hell I am going to reach 4,000 cities when I meet not only global benchmarks, but when I meet the bare minimum municipal solid waste management rules, leave alone plastic waste management rules, electronic waste and hazardous waste, biomedical waste. There are so many rules around that. We need to move fast. We can't be going in a very, very complacent way from public health point of view for improving human productivity, my kids' productivity, my neighborhood's productivity, from livability of cities and human economic development point of view. It's completely bizarre at the way we are going in terms of a business as usual approach. This has to be accelerated in every possible way. We need 100 Ramkis in the country. So when we talk about innovations, it's not just about startups. In fact, in my view, Mr. Masood, I interact with him very often. He's the biggest innovator because the waste that they handle, he is so bloody heterogeneous. They don't even know what's going to come next. Every day it's going to change. So they have to constantly look at technological innovations, process innovation. So it's not that we are only speaking about startups. At the same time, if I ask Mr. Masood, sir, would you like to work with 30 TPD of solid waste management? Masood sir will say, yaar, pehle 500 wala 500 TPD ka pehle dekhte hain, uske baad 30 TPD mein aayenge. So there is a space for everyone. There is a space for startups to sort of come and solve the problem. And we have more and more, these big players also to come to solve these problems. And we need, the underlying statement is we need innovations. We can't have the lack of clarity in terms of approaching the same way we have been approaching. I think that's a first and the foremost statement I would like to make. The second statement I would like to say, Mr. Anant, is WASH can be the new IT for India. If I move this on this scale from 2 to 4, I can create millions and millions of jobs. And why are we not doing it? When I can tell you, if we can focus in the next 5 years, we can, the way we have become a thought leader in vaccination, we can become a thought leader in water and sanitation, because we have solved our problems through Swachh Bharat mission, at least to a great extent. We can solve our water problems, we can solve our solid waste management problems, because these problems exist in India, which are much more complex. Innovations can be easily scaled up. So we are sitting on $1 billion worth of market, not just in India, but outside of India, which China is actually leveraging constantly. If you ask anybody who is a thought leader in waste to energy, China, 500 projects. So India has a great opportunity to innovate and create a huge livelihood opportunities. And the best part about this sector is it is an actually inclusion. It focuses on inclusion. An IT sector supports some, whereas water and sanitation sector, purely from opportunities point of view, it can impact everybody. So I think that's what is the experience we see in the last couple of years working here. Having said that, let me just give you, I don't want to jargonize this. I want to put it in a very basic understanding. The city leadership, if Pamela ji is there on the call, she can vouch me. Other day she called me. Saab, can you, we have some lakes in city of Warangal. Can we deal with bioremediation of these lakes, something called floating islands? Can we create a floaters which will look good, but also consume the pathogens, consume the sewage in this? It's a typical bioremediation process. It can be done. There are a lot of young colleagues working across the country. IITs have done it. NEERI has done it. All we need to do is to bring those into the city of Warangal. I got a call from UP. Trust me, Anand, 50% of my time on a day-to-day basis goes in receiving these calls from city commissioners, city leadership. Today I got a call on personal protective equipment from Telangana government. They want to standardize PPEs, they want to scale up. And same thing is happening in Andhra. Now there are no standards available for PPE, not for every product. We need to have systems in place. Now we have challenges with regard to lake protection, PPEs, plastics, food waste, solid waste management, dengue. In fact, I get a call from one of the cities in North India that they have a problem of dengue. Is there any IT solution to monitor and predict dengue cases? This is very, very common in some of the Western countries. They predict disease burden. So these information cities are desperately looking for, and they don't have information about what innovations are happening in the country. That's a sad story because they are day to day dealing with their usual problems of operations and maintenance. There is no time for innovations. There's no time for new ideas. First of all, an innovator goes, there are three problems. Trust. Why Pamela ji has to call us? Why XYZ has to call us? First of all, they don't know whether they can trust. Cost. There are no benchmarks available. Procurement process. There are no well-defined procurement process. And unfortunately, innovators also have very limited understanding of the government systems. I'm telling you, we have an innovator database of 157. And in fact, there are others where we have not piloted them, we have not tested them. There's more than 250 innovators are there in this only water and sanitation space. Now, the first thing somebody asked me, can I get 1 crore? I want to set up a plant for food waste processing. I would like to, I said, boss, I said, chalta nahi hai. Nobody will give you 1 crore from a city government without going through procurement process. There are rules and regulations. So this is the ground reality with regard to the demand side as well as on the supply side. Now, question is, how do we combine forces? I think this is the big challenge, but all of us are discussing in a way. So I think we need a platform. We need a facilitation process which will bring trust. If you ask innovators, do you trust government? They say they have very limited. If you ask, governments whether you trust innovators, these people, they come and go, there's absolutely no accountability. So how do you establish trust? How do you start with piloting, proof of concept and beyond? How do you ease procurement? Very important point, I think someone made. How do you, Mashelkar committee, that platform is now, it's not functional. How do you deal with quality assurance? How do you build capacities? How do you mentor and how do you finance? These are the practical day-to-day problems that we actually confront, and that led to a thought of what is called S-Hub, an innovation hub dedicated for water, sanitation and hygiene, including municipal solid waste. We reached out to, in fact, Dalberg has done this blueprint for us. We reached out to government of Telangana. We started a couple of activities, and Dasra is helping us. We just did, Anand, one event which you are aware of, what is called Ink Wash. And thanks to Mr. Masood, he funded this without asking questions. All we asked was, we want to bring both cities and innovators together like a TED platform. It was a super hit. We didn't spend more than 15 lakhs to 20 lakhs on that. This is pre-COVID, including travel, everything is about 15 lakhs. Now the multiplier effect of that is phenomenal. We could see ease of procurement happening in front of our eyes. For example, Namita ji on the call, she reached out. Nobody trusted GeoBag when she reached out. So we requested Warangal, can you give a piece of land, half an acre? She wants to pilot. Luckily, they trusted and given her that. And Namita has now implementing FSTPs in not less than 25 to 30 locations. Somebody has to trust Namita. So I think that procurement processes have to be eased. We need a technical advisory committee to standardize PPEs, public toilets. We need these KPIs and we need solid monitoring tools. So the point I'm making here, Mr. Anant, is looking at this conversation, what I think India needs is not one, multiples of these platforms where innovators and city governments to come together. And someone like Mr. Masood can play a catalytic role because he is like a big brother. As he rightly said, aggregation has to happen. It cannot be individuals going and messing up the market. We need an aggregation platform, quality assurance. And I think this is where I think is the way forward in my view. Now, last point, we keep talking about public, private, in this case, innovator and partnership. I think the next P in my view is philanthropy and a different form of CSR, not a project-based CSR, but an innovation-based CSR for scaling up this innovation. Scaling up this, for putting up these platforms. I think that's my thought process, listening to all this conversation. Thank you. I took a little more time, but I thought it's important to share our perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chari. And I think your passion and your really focus on how can we make this start off is critical. We have 4 minutes, and I did want to mention two things. I think I'd love to play back what are the takeaways so that we can then follow up with each other. And as Dasra, we will share contacts so that people can make connections. And you are already starting to do so on chat, which is great. There is also a video on the S Hub at ASCII, which we'll put on at 4:30. So people, I'd really encourage people to listen into that and see the great work which is happening. As we think about this, here is the 5 things which are coming through. And like I think Professor Chari said, it's quite timely. First is, how do we ensure that, and I think Bharat spoke about this as well, how do we ensure that as a sector, we come together to put down some longer term policy and plans, so innovators are not taken by surprise every 6 months. And without that, it's a non-starter. This is something which the sector can do, potentially leveraging coalitions. We talked about inclusive financial instruments. I think they're also thinking of bridge capital, because I think the government money comes, but you never know when it comes. So if it comes late, the recipient may not be there to take it. So how does bridge capital come into this fold? Breaking barriers early, especially for women, I think is going to be absolutely critical. I think fourthly, metrics to ensure there is simplicity, certification, some degree of standardization, so that people can talk about the same language and we don't create astronomical hurdles for innovators to move to the next level. And lastly, a very city-centric, hyper-local, like a Warangal approach or a Hyderabad approach or a Mumbai approach becomes important. And I think that is potentially one very powerful place that philanthropists can come in, because philanthropists are from cities and they have their cities and they have grown up in those cities. So how can that potentially come in becomes powerful? I'd love for Mohit to bring up the last poll, and really, this poll is important from a perspective of this sector has been underinvested. It has been ignored. It is an invisible sector, and now we are all feeling the pinch of an invisible sector not working. So Mohit, if you can bring up the poll, and then we thank all of you for joining, but please do wait for 5 minutes to see the video of S-Hub after that. The poll is on, so please do vote. Okay, Mohit, if you could put this on, if you could display the. So look, I think we do feel very encouraged that people are willing to learn more about innovations in the wash sector. this is a sector which is non-glamorous. It is also a sector which is not as tactile. You can't touch and feel like you do sectors like education or sometimes even health. It's a sector which potentially impacts many others. So we as Dasra and ASCII would love to open source the learnings around this, share more, and the 63% of this audience would like to learn more about this innovations. Please do reach out. The more we talk about this, the more this will go ahead. And there are some questions about SDG frameworks, others, we will compile it and we'll share it with the full audience, but also those who could not join. With that, I just want to thank everyone for joining, but please stay on. It'll be great to play the video, Mohit. And again, thank you so much for your patient involvement, but also for your questions and discussions. And big thanks to Ms. Pamela and all the participants for joining. I know it's been a very precious 2 hours that you've spent.
In India, 163 million do not have access to safe drinking water. 210 million people lack access to improved basic sanitation. 70% of India's sewage is left untreated. More than 40% of the plastic waste reaches streets, landfills, and water bodies. Lack of basic wash services has contributed to over 500,000 deaths in 2019. India has been on a landmark journey towards sustainable development goals to transform water, sanitation, and solid waste management sectors. The Indian government has made huge strides through its flagship policies, Swachh Bharat Mission and Jal Jeevan Mission. However, with an urban population of 377 million, which is expected to reach 590 million by 2030, the government's efforts need a complementary boost for India to achieve its goals. The cost-intensive and time-consuming conventional approach towards advancing water and sanitation hasn't reached the most vulnerable population. We need local-born thinkers and innovators who can look at the problem from multiple points of view, who can prototype ideas and scale rapidly, therefore improving service delivery, who can connect and collaborate with the government as well as the private sector. To catalyze innovations and to achieve scale with impact, Administrative Staff College of India has partnered with the government of Telangana and established S-Hub. The S-Hub, via its platform called Ink at Wash, is putting the spotlight on India's leading innovations, supporting and enabling them with greater public-private sector partnerships. This has led to large-scale impact, particularly in areas related to treatment of human waste. In the coming years, the Sanitation Hub will provide dedicated incubation support to guide innovators to transform India into an innovation lighthouse in WASH for the rest of the world. To move forward, India needs a collaborative effort to promote innovations in WASH for achieving sustainable development goals well ahead of time. Private philanthropy can deploy risk capital finance innovation. The government can provide a ready business environment for innovators to deploy solutions at scale. Innovators can test bold innovations that have the potential to transform India. Creating a sustainable world for all is possible. And we will create it together.
Thank you, everyone. If you could just punch in your scores for the feedback, that'll be great. And then post that, we can leave the call. Thank you.